Out in the scorched red dirt of the semi-arid pastoral country, a man is heaving basalt boulders by hand into an empty sun-baked wash. The bed hasn't carried running water past the wet season in over a century. Catchment authorities and hydrologists would look at what he is doing and warn him that choking the natural drainage channel with rough rock will destroy fish passage and ruin local aquatic life. But that warning collapses under a single brutal fact of the country. There are no native fish here. There is barely any moisture at all that across this 56,000 hectare station, annual rainfall hovers under 250 millimeters. When downpours do hit the sun-hardened claypans, the deluge roars through the eroded gullies for a few violent days before disappearing into cracked sand long before the dry summer sets in. The man shifting the stones is no civil engineer or government surveyor. He made his living healing domestic animals. Yet the crude rubble wall he is stacking against the baking earth is about to trigger one of the most astonishing ecological turnarounds on the continent. His name is Scott Campbell. If you are picturing a seasoned, third-generation bushman who spent his lifetime in stock saddles, look closer. Campbell is a veterinary surgeon who built a massive, nation-spanning network of hundreds of animal clinics. After selling his commercial enterprise and stepping away from the corporate sphere, he returned to the dry tablelands where his family had long ago grazed cattle and served the outback community. He acquired a massive, run-down pastoral holding spanning more than 500 square kilometers purely as an investment. Then he walked out past the homestead and truly looked at the country. What he found was a landscape in absolute ecological collapse. The broad alluvial flats, the low-lying country that should have served as prime grazing ground, were choked with woody weed scrub, invasive saltbush, and lifeless dirt. The creeks were nothing more than deeply incised erosion gullies. Whenever brief seasonal rain lashed the catchment, torrential runoff tore through these scars, stripping topsoil and dropping underground, leaving nothing behind but baked clay. To any grazier running stock, this is a slow, fatal bleed. Cattle cannot survive on a brief flush of green feed in late spring. They need persistent water and rich summer pasture through the scorching heat of January and February. Campbell had purchased an expansive station where the most vital country simply dried out halfway through the year. Almost everyone, including Campbell at first, accepted this degradation as an unchangeable law of nature. The common wisdom held that this was simply what the dry interior looked like: barren spinifex flats, scrub, dust, and 250 millimeters of unpredictable rain. But that baseline assumption was fundamentally wrong. The creek was not bone dry because the heavens had withheld the rain. It was dead because the landscape had completely lost the capacity to hold what fell. The water was not missing from the system. It was simply bleeding out of the landscape too quickly to be of any use. To understand how such vast open country could turn into a biological desert, Campbell did what few pastoralists ever think to do. He buried himself in the historical archives, reading the faded journals of early 19th century frontier explorers and bush pioneers who had traversed this exact catchment before pastoral leases and settlement carved it up. What those early survey logs described sounded like pure fantasy compared to the scorched dust and stony gullies stretching toward the horizon today. The early explorers recorded a catchment teeming with an astonishing population of native ecological engineers, creatures that shaped, dammed, and managed every bend of the waterways. In their original state, hundreds of thousands of these industrious animals populated the river systems, transforming the entire catchment into a living, interconnected biological network. Picture what that scale of natural engineering truly means across an arid basin. This was not merely a handful of scattered waterholes in a creek. It was a massive, valley-wide mosaic of stepped wetlands and vegetated pools engineered from ridge to ridge. Their continuous, interwoven barriers backed floodwaters up across the broad alluvial plains. As storm surges were checked, deep sediment and silt settled out of suspension, gradually building up nutrient-rich, sponge-like soil profiles across the valley floor. When heavy monsoonal troughs or winter downpours swept through the hills, The water did not carve destructive trenches and vanish into the sand. Instead, it spread wide across the flats, sinking deep into the subsoil and steadily recharging the local water table. That stored moisture slowly seeped out through the dry, searing months of summer, sustaining cool, perennial billabongs and keeping natural springs bubbling right through the hottest droughts. The entire catchment functioned as a colossal subterranean sponge, and the native engineers were the heartbeat driving that continuous hydration cycle. Then came the commercial trappers and early pastoral clearers. Driven by global demand and colonial expansion, they systematically eradicated the creatures from every creek and gully across the ranges. In an era where wildlife was seen either as a harvestable commodity or an obstacle to be cleared, the extraction was ruthlessly complete. What followed was a silent ecological catastrophe that played out over generations. With no living engineers left to patch and maintain the complex network of barriers, the ancient structures gradually decayed, gave way, and blew out in flash floods. The flowing water, stripped of the resistance that had checked its momentum for millennia, unleashed its raw physical power directly against the soft alluvial beds. It gouged straight down into the fragile soils, cutting deep, vertical-sided erosion trenches into the floodplain. Every single eroded gully instantly turned into a high-speed drain, pulling the shallow subterranean water table down with it into the abyss. As the water table collapsed beneath the valley floor, the living landscape withered. The deep-rooted perennial grasses and native rushes that had carpeted the floodplains for thousands of years starved of moisture and died off. The reliable springs that had watered stock through scorching heat waves went dead. In their place, hardy, unpalatable woody scrub and opportunistic weeds marched down from the stony ridges, colonizing the desiccated flats. Over the course of a century, what had been an interconnected wetland became a sun-baked wasteland. When Campbell looked at the historical evidence, the obvious initial impulse was simple: restore the animals. Bring the natural ecosystem engineers back into the catchment, and let biology repair what human greed had dismantled. Yet any attempt to simply release animals into this degraded landscape ran straight into an ecological trap so vicious it was fatal. The original ecosystem builders depended entirely on deep, permanent water to shelter from predators and sustain their colonies. They relied on dense stands of native riverside shrubs and lush sedges for food and building materials. But 100 years of severe water table collapse had scoured every trace of riparian growth from the bare banks. Dropping living creatures into a sun-bleached, dry gully with zero food and no permanent pools was not ecological restoration. It was an immediate death sentence. Here lay the cruel paradox paralyzing the entire basin. The landscape required permanent moisture and thick vegetation to support the engineers, but it required the engineers to generate the moisture and grow the vegetation. Every critical link in the ecological chain depended on another link that had already been obliterated. The country was locked in a self-reinforcing death spiral. Campbell recognized that nature was entirely powerless to heal itself because the physical foundation had been smashed. He didn't need to rebuild the entire historical population overnight. He needed to find the single fulcrum point and break the loop. His chosen tool was remarkably primitive: basalt rock. Gathering loose fieldstone, gravel, and fallen timber straight from his own paddocks, he began throwing together low, porous rock weirs right across the dry channel bed. To any passing pastoralist or rural lands inspector, they looked completely amateurish, no different from the rough rock fords or causeways station owners push across dry creek crossings to move a tractor. Yet this basic, unlicensed earthwork was precisely what triggered panic among regional river managers and state water authorities. Dumping loose stone into a designated watercourse is the quickest way to draw formal warnings for illegal obstruction and habitat destruction. But that bureaucratic hysteria collided with the stark reality on the ground. Regulators were warning him about blocking fish passage and suffocating aquatic habitat in a bone-dry ditch that held neither fish nor water for 10 months of the year. Campbell was ready to defy conventional river engineering with a pile of rocks. The fundamental genius of the crude rock structure lay in the raw physics of hydrological resistance. A natural organic weir and a mound of field basalt perform the exact same mechanical duty. They rob fast-moving storm runoff of its destructive kinetic energy. That single mechanical function is the entire secret. When you break the sudden surge of spring runoff and heavy seasonal storms, instead of allowing it to tear unchecked through an incised channel, the water finally has time to behave as it did before settlement. Instead of scouring the bedrock bare, the backed-up water rises, fans out sideways, and saturates the broad alluvial flats. It percolates deep down into the ancient, desiccated subsoil layers, replenishing the depleted subterranean aquifers beneath the floodplain. Because these porous stone mounds are loose and unmortared, they do not act like impenetrable concrete barrages. They allow a steady, filtered base flow to trickle gradually through the rocks, passing clear, filtered water downstream at a manageable pace. Construct a continuous succession of these simple rock structures along several kilometers of dry creek bed, and you create an interconnected chain of deep, reflective pools. The crucial distinction is that basalt rocks do not need to forage for food. They do not suffer during severe droughts, and they cannot be hunted to extinction. They sit silently in the riverbed, enduring the elements and performing the exact hydraulic role the vanished ecosystem engineers once provided, holding the line until the underlying biological conditions can recover. Campbell was not applying brute force to conquer the landscape. He was applying hydrological leverage at the single most critical failure point in a broken system. Then, the desert country delivered a phenomenon that no living landholder in the district had ever witnessed. As the subterranean water table rose back toward the surface, dormant native seed banks buried in the dry dirt for generations suddenly awakened. Nobody sowed them. Nobody bought commercial seed mixes. The ancient native grasses, deep-rooted reeds, and river rushes pushed up through the sun-baked ground entirely on their own. The rising groundwater steadily drowned out the invasive scrub and woody weeds that had overrun the flats. Across a single 5-kilometer stretch of the primary watercourse, Campbell constructed more than 100 of these low-profile stone structures. A desolate, fire-prone gully that had remained barren and cracked for over a century transformed into a flourishing, verdant ribbon of wetland. On land that had been written off as marginal scrub, station managers were now harvesting rich spring pasture and grazing heavy mobs of cattle well into the harshest, driest stretches of late summer. The regeneration was not a financial liability. It was dramatically increasing the carrying capacity of the entire pastoral enterprise. The transformation along the creek was not a minor, localized improvement. It was a full-scale ecological tipping point. The incised gully, that had been a dry scar for 11 months of the year, began to flow steadily through all 4 seasons. A dead wash had become a permanent, living watercourse. And then came the ultimate vindication against the initial bureaucratic warnings. The very waterway that conservation officers and government hydrologists feared would be ruined by dumped rock began to teem with aquatic life. Native freshwater fish species, long vanished from the regional subcatchment, populated the deep, shaded pools in thriving numbers. The rocks had not destroyed the fishery. The rocks were the sole reason a living ecosystem existed at all. The very intervention feared by theoretical desk models had spontaneously generated the vital habitat required to bring the stream back to life. Skeptics might have dismissed this as a stroke of sheer fortune, a lucky pocket of country blessed by an unusual run of wet seasons. But Campbell did not leave it to chance. He replicated the exact same hand-stacked stone design across multiple dry valleys and degraded tributaries spanning thousands of hectares across the station. In every single gully, the physics produced the exact same biological chain reaction. The water table lifted, dense native pastures re-established, the woody weed cover retreated, and rich green floodplains spread out across the red earth. When the identical, low-cost intervention generates the same profound recovery across every valley floor, it is no longer an anomaly. It is an undeniable, repeatable ecological mechanism. State forestry officers, academic researchers, and catchment management authorities soon took notice, documenting the property as a definitive case study in natural landscape rehydration and floodplain reconnection. Neighbors from adjoining stations, initially dubious of the unorthodox earthworks, rode out to inspect the green corridors and began adopting the same stone techniques along their own eroded creek beds. Then, during the peak of an explosive bushfire season, a controlled burn broke containment lines on a neighboring boundary. Driven by blistering winds across parched scrub, a raging wildfire swept over 2,000 hectares of pastoral country, bearing straight down on the station's core infrastructure and stockyards. But when the towering firefront slammed into the restored river valley, it stopped dead. The wide, sodden flats and green riparian grasses formed an impenetrable natural firebreak that completely starved the flames of dry fuel. Campbell had set out simply to drought-proof his stock paddocks and produce resilient green feed. Without realizing it, he had constructed an unburnable shield that saved the entire property from total destruction. The benefits rippled far beyond the station boundaries. Because the porous rock weirs retained deep moisture in the soil, the property no longer required intensive surface irrigation in the early spring heat. With licensed water entitlements left unused in the channel, a steady, measured flow trickled downstream to neighboring pastoralists. Water that had once raged by in a brief, muddy flash flood before vanishing was now released gradually through the driest months, turning one landholder's restored gully into a reliable water supply for the entire district. Yet this is no universal silver bullet for every dry creek on the continent. The method works only under precise geomorphic conditions. The valley gradient must be gentle enough to avoid structural blowouts. The subsoil must possess the alluvial capacity to absorb water, and the dormant native seed bank must still survive beneath the surface. Misplace rough stone in high-energy gorges or alongside critical rural infrastructure, and you risk severe erosion rather than floodplain hydration. Its power lies precisely in being an exact hydraulic fit, not indiscriminate magic. The most absurd hurdle Campbell faced was not the unforgiving climate, but administrative red tape. Under state water legislation, a seasonal wash with no permanent pools or native fish required no works permit. But the moment his hand-stacked basalt turned the dry gully into a perennial, fish-bearing stream, it triggered environmental classifications that made his ongoing work subject to strict regulatory compliance. The very success of the restoration created the legal knot that threatened to penalize it. He had to pay administrative fines and lobby for legislative reforms just to continue repairing his own country. For more than a century, generations of landholders had accepted the dry gullies, bare dust, and woody scrub as the natural baseline of the semi-arid interior. It looked natural only because nobody alive remembered the country before it was broken. It was not an immutable wasteland. It was an unhealed fracture. A living hydrological engine that had functioned for millennia had ground to a halt when its original keystone architect was removed. Campbell did not pour concrete, sink multi-million-dollar bores, or attempt to conquer the terrain with heavy industrial machinery. He merely found the single broken cog in the landscape, repaired it with local stone, and allowed the sleeping seeds and ancient aquifers to do the rest. The land was never dead. It was simply waiting for the flow to be checked. If you want us to investigate more forgotten solutions to the continent's toughest environmental riddles, consider following along. The land does not need to be conquered. It only needs us to stop bleeding what little rain falls from the sky.